accueillir Catherine T. Dunlop, qui est professeure associée d'histoire et directrice des études supérieures en histoire environnementale à l'Université d'État du Montana à Bozeman. Elle est également éditrice en chef de la section galerie Visual Culture de la revue Environmental History. Et le manuscrit de son livre actuel porte sur l'histoire environnementale et les cultures du Mistral dans le Sud. Donc c'était très important pour nous d'avoir à la fois la perspective de chercheurs qui travaillaient ici sur ce territoire et d'autres chercheurs justement qui viennent de territoires lointains, ce qui nous permet d'avoir un renouvellement de ce regard. Et donc merci d'être avec nous, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. And I teach at a university in a state called Montana, which is known as Big Sky Country. But today I'm going to talk about your sky here in Provence, the Mistral. And I do want to say, I know this audience probably knows a lot about the Mistral already, so I just want to put my humility out there as a foreigner who is talking about your regional wind. But I want to start off by saying a few things about this wind, especially for those of you who may also be from out of the country. So on the days when this cold northwesterly wind blows across Provence, this typically warm and tranquil region in the south of France goes through a complete transformation. You'll see the cypress trees swaying violently. You'll see the Mediterranean waters become frothy and tempestuous. You'll see wheat fields begin to flow like ocean waves. And it's such a powerful wind that locals have called it a curse equal to the 7 plagues of Egypt. And the name Mistral itself comes from the Latin word magistral or magistralis, which literally means the master. So in this painting composed not too far from where we're sitting today in Arles, the artist Paul Gauguin captured a scene of Arlesienne women in traditional regional clothing walking through the Place Lamartine as the Mistral blew against them. You can see in this painting that the women's bodies are draped in thick black cloaks, not unlike the cone-shaped trees that are behind them in protective yellow cloth. Their shoulders are hunched over, and their hands reach up to protect their mouths from the gusts of wind. But despite their bodies' defensive postures, you can see here that their faces have resolve, and they're quite calm, undisturbed as they move forward. There was, after all, nothing that unusual about the Mistral, and these women would have been quite used to its presence in their lives. Blowing for approximately a third of the year in southern France, the Mistral was a familiar part of these women's local environment. The Arlesienne pictured in this painting would have grown up hearing proverbs and sayings about the Mistral, that it blew for periods of 3, 6, or 9 days, or that its force was strong enough to rip the horns off a bull, or to tear the tail off a donkey. And over the course of their lifetimes, these women would have acclimated themselves not only to the cold touch of the Mistral, but also to the sounds that the Mistral generates when it rushes through Arles and whistles through those terracotta ceiling tiles. Unlike the trade winds that stretch across vast open oceans, the Mistral is an example of what meteorologists call a local wind, meaning that it is the product of atmospheric conditions and topographical landforms that are found in a very specific geographic area. So first, at the atmospheric level, the Mistral results from an imbalance between, and here's when I'm going to be a weather girl. You have the high pressure zone up here, and this air is literally sucked downward into this low pressure zone in the Mediterranean Sea. So it's really just, the air is just sort of magnetically pulled down when you have this weather phenomenon. Second, the Mistral's speed and direction are influenced by the unique shape of the regional landforms in the south of France. So as the Mistral's cold air blows toward the south, it passes through mountain valleys, and these valleys compress the air like a garden hose, causing it to pick up even more speed. So by the time that the mistral reaches the open landscape at the mouth of the Rhone River that we just heard about, its gusts can feel as powerful as a hurricane, sometimes reaching over 100 kilometers per hour. Like other powerful local winds across the globe, including the Föhn wind of Austria and Switzerland, the Sirocco of North Africa, the Santa Anas of Southern California, and the Chinook wind of Montana, the mistral has forced human beings who live in its path to come up with creative adaptations to its powerful presence. While the term landscape is widespread, the concept of a windscape, a geographic zone invisibly imprinted by the unseen force of moving air, is less familiar to many of us. But when you look carefully at the artworks from the 19th century, when Provence attracted large numbers of painters from across the world, the dominating yet invisible presence of the mistral windscape is actually quite hard to miss. You could see it in Claude Monet's paintings that you see here. You can see it in the depictions of swirling agricultural landscapes in the work of Vincent van Gogh. You could also see the mistral windscape present in the work of regional artists, such as you see here in the puffs of smoke swirling above the port city of Marseille. And even in the path of a simple shepherd walking along his way, journeying down a country road with his flock of sheep. So the mistral these visual archives reveal was both an extraordinary and an ordinary part of life in Provence. As overwhelming and disruptive as the mistral's gusts can be, the people living in this region learned over the centuries how to adapt to its invisible power. People working in every trade and every industry in Provence, farming, sailing, milling, shepherding, meteorology, medicine, commerce, and of course landscape painting, developed creative and smart ways of living, dwelling, cultivating, and navigating in the midst of the mistral's frequent gusts. The story of Provençal society's long-standing and intimate bond with the mistral, I will argue today, offers us a valuable and an urgently needed perspective on the history of regional climate adaptation and the connections that have formed over the past 2 centuries between regional environments and regional identities in France. So my talk today will proceed in 3 parts. First, I'm going to discuss the mistral's significant role in shaping traditional Provençal lifeways. So in the centuries before industrialization, working people in Provence adapted to the gusts in their everyday lives through place-based dwellings, tools, energy systems, travel routes, and work schedules. And while industrial modernity wiped out many of these traditional ways of living, I find it to be very helpful to look back at, as particularly in our age right now, at these traditional forms of regional adaptations to perhaps get some historical perspective on the new phase of adaptations that that Europeans are seeking to rebuild and establish in the next 10, 20, 50 years. Second, I'm going to examine how the mistral factored into the rise of Provençal regionalism, which first came to be a force in the late 19th century. I'll discuss how the Félibrige, one of the most powerful citizen-led Provençal organizations or provincial organizations in 19th century France, elevated the mistral to an iconic status in regionalist discourse, framing this violent and domineering wind as a cherished identity-giving feature of Provence. Regional ecosystems therefore helped to valorize the existence of French regional identities at a time when the modern nation-state was becoming an increasingly strong presence in people's lives. I will thus argue that natural patrimony and cultural patrimony have been closely intertwined in France for well over 100 years. And in the last part of my talk, I'll discuss the contemporary implications of this historical research. What can Provence's long-term history of climate adaptation and its people's pride in their natural patrimony teach government officials, scientists, and citizens as they confront the current climate crisis? And while my talk today will focus on the Mistral and its relationship to people and places in Provence, the story I'll be telling today is one that will resonate in many of France's distinctive regional environments. As you'll see on this map, France is actually one of the most ecologically diverse countries in Europe, with 5 distinct bioregions. So the story I'm telling today can shed light on some of these other stories, these other really special places that exist across France, and indeed across Europe, and indeed across the world. So first, let me turn to some of the traditional forms of wind adaptation in Provence. So until industrial modernity disrupted many of the traditional lifeways and trades in this region, much of Provençal society lived in close outdoor contact with the Mistral. While the wind posed serious challenges for working people, it also sparked grassroots, innovative climate adaptations, particularly for workers in traditional industries like sailing, milling, and shepherding. Having a strong knowledge of the Mistral's behavior and possessing the right skills and the right tools for managing its gusts was key to building a successful life in this region. Let's turn to some examples of what regional climate adaptation looked like. Let me start here. For many of these people before industrialization. So let's begin with agriculture. As we heard earlier today, a really important and sort of passionate industry that attracts a lot of passion in this part of France. So known as the manjo fango, I'm probably butchering that term, Provençal term, or the mud eater, the Mistral was a perennial challenge for Provençal farmers. So in a Mediterranean climate that's already dry and already arid, any small amount of water that can be preserved can be very, very helpful. So to prevent their crops from being dried out, farmers would plant, and vintners as well, these hedgerows that would form sort of natural living organic walls to block the wind's gusts, placed strategically in the path of the wind. So while farmers made use of hedgerows to grow their crops in a windswept environment, other aspects of traditional Provençal food production benefited from full exposure to the Mistral's gusts. So on hilltops in Provence, rural communities strategically placed windmills on exposed places, which enabled millers to grind their grain as it was harvested in the region, especially in areas where water mills were not possible or accessible. So in traditional Provençal culture, millers were the closest thing to meteorologists. Not only did they make bread, but they also had an impressive amount of bottom-up, localized, place-based regional knowledge about the weather. In addition to hedgerows and windmills, we can also look to traditional Provençal dwellings. We just heard about this. For evidence of creative local adaptations to the Mistral. In the Camargue wetlands, you will find clusters of traditional Camargue huts that housed local fishermen and agricultural producers. These curious-looking structures, made from locally harvested reeds and materials, were thoughtfully designed for coexisting with the Mistral windscape. And as these two diagrams show, the rounded shape of the northwesterly end of the Camargue huts resulted in far less turbulence and noise than a typical rectangular house when confronted with a gust from the Mistral. More evidence of smart, locally generated climate adaptation can be found in regional boat design. Fishing and maritime communities have a long history in this part of France. So for people whose livelihoods depended on water transportation, knowing how to navigate in these winds was essential. Traders in Arles, for example, right here, developed a method for piggybacking on the Mistral and riding their sailboats on its gusts downriver at great speeds, allowing them to deliver their goods to market more quickly. Favored regional boat designs for these Rhone River journeys included boats like avec, boats that were agile and fast and were easy to move and navigate with a sudden burst of the mistral. So in order to help them predict sudden changes in the weather, it was not uncommon for sailors in this region around Arles to carry around a dried out dead bird called a divino vent. The bird's body would expand and contract with subtle changes in the atmosphere, helping the mariner to seek shelter or change course if necessary. Over time, however, these close working relationships, these really intimate relationships that formed between working people in Provence and the Mistral appeared outdated and even uncivilized to many progress-oriented French state officials in Paris. Structures like windmills and sailboats that were specifically adapted to the needs of regional climate systems were deemed too inefficient and unreliable to meet the needs of a growing national French industrial economy. Steam-powered mills and steam-powered boats became a much more attractive option. The demands of France's growing national and imperial economy were simply too much for this kind of traditional, small-scale, organic economic system that regions like Provence had sustained. Meanwhile, scientific approaches to observing the weather began to displace this sort of embodied and localized kind of knowledge about the weather. While shepherds, millers, and sailors had once known the Mistral in their bones, by the end of the 19th century, the new experts on the Mistral often didn't even live here. They would live in Paris and they would design weather maps at the National Weather Bureau there. A professional class of meteorologists that sort of created this very disembodied kind of knowledge about the wind. So overall, the perception of both the Mistral and the locally adapted wind culture that it sustained were seen as a problem by progress-minded French state officials intent on a one-size-fits-all national modernization plan. The country's diverse regional environments and the local economies that they sustained were perceived by many of these people in power as vestiges of a disorderly past rather than as keys to the nation's long-term environmental sustainability, which is, of course, the big focus of the French government today. So now I want to turn to the role of nature in Provençal region building. So in Provence itself, there was among some people considerable grief at the loss of traditional wind-centered ways of living. In 1854, a group of middle-class writers and artists came together to form an organization called the Félibrige, centered right here in Arles, with the goal of recording, preserving, and defending Provençal regional heritage against the centralizing French state and its aligned industrial economy. While the Provençal regionalists' goal of preserving their language, traditions, costumes, and monuments has been well documented, scholars have actually paid surprisingly little attention to how the Félibrige has thought about Provence's climate and natural environment, and in many ways romanticized both of those. In tracing how these writers and artists framed the power and the meaning of the Mistral, we can learn a great deal about the connections between environmental and regionalist discourses that became intertwined in late 19th century France. So the leader of the Félibrige was a man with a perfect last name, Frédéric Mistral, a writer and poet who collected and published the first ever dictionary of the Provençal language and went on to win a Nobel Prize in literature. Like the wind whose name becomes you, strong is the holy breath that inspires you, a fellow organization member wrote about this towering regional figure, Mistral. Born to a prosperous rural family, Mistral was an educated bourgeois who became passionate about defending his regional homeland from the threats of modernization. Mistral's stories were almost always centered on rural Provence, where ordinary peasants were usually his heroes. But nature, too, appeared very frequently in his works. In his epic poem Mireille, for example, he gives the natural environment its own voice. In one scene, it's harvest time, and the Mistral arrives and starts to shake the blades of wheat that cry out and say, the mistral has come, it's time for us to be harvested. So it's a nature that is truly alive and truly has, in this literature, a voice. In another scene, the mistral is depicted in a semi-religious light. God opens his hand, the poet wrote, and the mistral, with lightning and storm, leaves his hand like 3 eagles. From the deep sea and its ravines to its chasms, they go eagerly. What the writer Frédéric Mistral put into writing, Provençal painters were putting into visual language through their artworks. The mistral was a frequent presence in the canvases composed by regional painters like Émile Loubon, an artist who had trained with the Barbizon School in northern France before returning south to found his own naturalist school of painting called the École de Marseille. Rather than seeing the natural and the human worlds as separate, Loubon portrayed natural landscapes as fundamentally humanized places where people learn to adapt and carry on their everyday work in the face of challenging outdoor conditions. Both the immediate and the long-term actions of the mistral are visible in Loubon's famous canvas depicting a view of Marseille from the outside of the city. The clear sky, the smoke blowing in Marseille in the distance, the crisp outlines of the gray, rocky cliffs of the Calanque to the east of the city, all demonstrate the short-term atmospheric effects of the mistral. But in addition to these effects, Loubon also took note of the mistral's long-term impacts on the region's ecology. In the arid ground that is free from vegetation, in the dust thrown in the air, in the wind-tilted tree in the middle right of the canvas, in highlighting this interpenetration of soil, air, and water, Loubon established a narrative of Provençal nature as a holistic system that he revered as a thing of beauty. The mistral in this context was not reduced to an ephemeral or a momentary phenomenon. Rather, the wind came across as a key strand in a web of ecological processes that together produced a unique sense of place in Provence. The connection that regional painters and artists had forged between Provence's cultural patrimony and its natural environment was affirmed by their selection of a wind rose as the frontispiece for the Félibrige's literary and artistic journal. Labeled in the Provençal language, the old-fashioned wind rose offered the journal's readers a grounding in their regional geography. Unlike the French national map centered around Paris, the Provençal wind rose oriented the reader in an ecologically distinctive regional setting, surrounded by named winds that only they would be able to understand, and that included their region's master wind, the mistral. So in 1906, shortly before the end of his life, Frédéric Mistral donated his Nobel Prize money to found a museum in Arles dedicated to the Provençal heritage. Much of the museum's original collection included forms of material culture, model boats, farming implements, clothing, weather vanes that had ethnographic value for documenting the traditional livelihoods of Provençal people. Just last year, many of you probably already know this, the museum reopened its doors in 2021 after a 10-year-long renovation with new exhibits and guided tours that encourage a fresh and evolving view of Provençal identity. The repurposing of this museum in Arles demonstrates both the continued importance of regional history in Provence, but also the ongoing debate over what that identity means. So while many of the pieces found in this museum that you can see here have been analyzed for their cultural significance, I have argued today that we can also interpret them as environmental objects, capable of telling fascinating stories about how people adapted to life with the mistral. Nothing about the form or uses of these objects was inevitable or predetermined. The diverse manner in which inland farmers, Camargue fishermen, or Rhone River sailors adapted their daily lives to the mistral reflects what French geographers have often called possibilism, a wide variety of possible ways in which people can choose to adapt to their environments. Yet despite the long history of wind adaptation, long and varied history of wind adaptation in this region, The mistral was not recognized as a feature of a collective Provençal identity until relatively recently, until the late 19th century, when region builders like Frédéric Mistral and Émile Loubon fixated on nature as a precious form of regional patrimony. In regional literature and art, the mistral became a perfect symbol of Southern distinctiveness. Wild and free, the mistral defied Paris's civilizing mission, keeping Provence untamable. While the anti-modern political and cultural program of the Félibrige has to some extent faded, the idea of the mistral as an authentic part of the Provençal experience has not. You don't have to look far in the south of France to see the mistral's name on cafes, street signs, and parks. You can see its name on bath products and perfumes to give consumer goods an authentic regional flair, entre guillemets. Though their relationship has evolved since the 19th century, regional identity and regional nature remain linked in powerful ways. Wind sailing, kite flying, and windsurfing have all become popular tourist draws in the south of France. Every year, the city of Marseille hosts a festival of wind at Prado Beach to celebrate the life-giving joy that living in a raucous windscape can bring to an urban population. Indeed, the enduring relationship between French regional identity and regional environments has attracted the attention of the French national government, which has begun to reconsider its one-size-fits-all environmental and energy planning of the past. In the next few years, Siemens Gamesa wind turbines will be installed off the coast of Marseille as part of the French national electricity company's Provence Grand Large project. While France still relies heavily on nuclear power, regional energy sources like wind power are reassuming some of the importance that they once held in different French regions. Regions, furthermore, have taken on a leadership role in French sustainability initiatives. The French state has recently tasked its regional councils, each of which represent one or more historic French provinces, with the job of developing region-specific climate adaptation plans for the next 20 to 50 years. Provence and its neighboring territories, which form this larger region called PACA, are currently forming a climate adaptation plan tailored to their specific ecosystem. Called GREC Sud, this council of regional stakeholders from PACA includes climate experts, decision makers, university researchers, citizens, nonprofit organizations, whose job is to adapt the socioeconomic system in this region to a changing climate. And this kind of region-led initiative is important because social science has shown that communities care significantly more about climate change when it affects the specific regional and local places where they live, work, build traditions, and family memories. In Provence, climate change is already disrupting many people's close personal feeling of home, including regular visits from the Mistral. Everywhere I've gone in Provence, I've been coming here for many years, people have told me how much they've noticed the Mistral changing a bit. It's becoming more erratic, unpredictable, unlike the more regular weather patterns of their childhoods. And scientific research backs up what I have been hearing anecdotally. While in recent decades it showed signs of slowing, the Mistral now looks to be speeding up. Overall, scientists agree that global atmospheric conditions are such that the Mistral's future frequency, speed, and even its zone of movement is entirely uncertain and is likely subject to change. As scientists model the Mistral's future behavior, the wind is already interacting in dangerous ways with a contemporary Provençal landscape that is ridden with drought. A natural desiccating force, the Mistral is exacerbating dry conditions that threaten the longevity of traditional regional industries like wine and olive oil production. When it moves across dry vegetation on parched hillsides, the Mistral helps to spread fast-moving wildfires that have destroyed homes and businesses in the region. And yet, even with these difficult realities, there is something hopeful that we can learn from the story of regional climate adaptations in the French past. People in this region have been living, working, and dwelling alongside the Mistral's fierce gusts for centuries. Through creativity, humility, and hard work, new kinds of climate adaptation are still possible in this region today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this presentation. We now have time for questions, and as I was saying, you can both ask them to Catherine T. Dunlop and Estelle Roquette as well. Vous pouvez autant poser les questions à Catherine T. Dunlop et à Estelle Roquette si vous voulez, vu les liens évidemment géographiques et historiques entre les deux présentations.
Well, first of all, thank you for these two contributions, which really allow us to be more rooted also, I guess, into the ground where we're standing. And I think that really the common feature between both of your contributions is the fact that nothing is permanent, that it's not linear, that it's not good or bad, but that it's in constant evolution, and that adaptation has been humans' privilege or curse since the outset, I guess. So what I would like to understand is how can we prepare those who precisely are not autochthonous or indigenous and who have not received that knowledge through either living in these places for a long time or through an eagerness to learn it. How could we immerse, how can we imagine activities or education or something to help us be in touch with those natural forces more? I mean, today we're in an air-conditioned space and we talk about environment. I've been resisting the temptation to just go outside and be a bit more in touch with the forces of nature. But how can we, on a day-to-day basis, bring this reality closer to people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's the question right now is what you're asking. And I guess I would say that my belief is that that this very overwhelming thing, the climate crisis, is, it's obviously occurring at a global scale. That's, obvious to everybody. But the way in which people can feel like they can make some impact or, in a way, be less depressed, is to act more locally and regionally. And so I think that, and I'm a university professor, so I teach young students that you want them to feel that sense of hopefulness. And so one of the things I really like to do with the Mistral, with my students in Montana, for example, is to show these kind of comparisons of how in different parts of the world, these really unique sort of natural features, how they become intertwined with local identities and cultures, and how that can be a really beautiful thing to see, the kind of this sense of a natural heritage, and that it's not the same across the world. It's very diverse. Even in Provence, it's a very diverse thing. So I think that to encourage people to get involved at the local level as much as they can with any kind of adaptation, because I think what I really learned from the working people of 19th century France is that these sorts of strategies don't have to come from a book or from the top down or from the state. They can come from communities, and they can come from traditions and people coming together as free people. That it doesn't have to be you don't have to wait for the state to tell you what to do. So I think that's another way of thinking about action. It can be something as simple as how you choose to get to work, or yeah. But it's such a big question. Yes.
Estelle, tu veux répondre également à cette question?
Oui, je veux bien. Moi, vous nous demandiez comment pouvons-nous changer le regard. C'est un peu, je m'entends parler, c'est désagréable. Comment changer le regard des populations sur l'impermanence des choses? Parce qu'on nous a appris, justement, en Camargue ou dans la région, que les digues allaient définitivement nous protéger. C'est vrai que le climat nous renvoie des alertes, Et ces alertes, il faut qu'elles puissent être entendues, comprises, sans affolement. Donc le rôle que nous pouvons avoir, nous, les locaux, qui pouvons nous adresser, du moins à une population et à ses enfants, parce que je crois beaucoup plus en l'avenir aux enfants camarguais ou arlésiens ou locaux ou du monde, qui sont beaucoup plus sensibles que nous le sommes, nous, à ces changements, qui les ont intégrés de toute façon. Voilà, c'est comment, je ne veux pas employer le mot accepter, mais savoir que voilà, c'est comme ça arrive, comme le savaient autrefois les gens qui vivaient dans des régions où il y avait des aléas. Voilà, l'aléa existe et on ne peut pas le maîtriser. Donc moi, mon rôle, c'est de l'expliquer dans le musée, par exemple, ou aux enfants qui viennent visiter à travers des expositions, des livres. Petit à petit, c'est d'arriver à conquérir, comme le paradigme de la toute-puissance a conquis, avec des preuves à l'appui aussi, qu'on était capable de maîtriser la nature. Eh bien, il faut déconstruire cette vision petit à petit dans les nouvelles générations et puis leur apprendre que c'est pas dramatique si on doit se déplacer ou si on doit se débrouiller justement pour habiter moins loin de son travail, y aller à pied. C'est des choses tout comme je crois qu'aujourd'hui les jeunes, grâce à Erasmus, ils se déplacent dans le monde beaucoup plus facilement que nos grands-parents. Et bien à l'avenir aussi, il faudra qu'ils apprennent, ils apprendront de toute évidence à vivre avec cet aléa et peut-être à raccourcir les distances, parce que nous les avons rallongées. On prend la voiture, moi je fais 60 km tous les jours, mais alors que ma grand-mère n'était jamais sortie de son village, quoi. Donc je pense qu'il y a une juste mesure à trouver avec tout ça.
Merci beaucoup.
Oui, mais je vous parlais parfaitement français, donc je peux vous poser ma question.
Oui, oui.
S'adapter à l'Holocène, c'était, disons, une certaine façon, mais s'adapter à l'Anthropocène, c'est une toute autre histoire. Oui. Donc, est-ce que les différents participants, les différents scientifiques, etc., sont conscients du changement complet d'échelle et que le mot adaptation est un mot associé à une époque, les 12 000 dernières années, qui est assez peu adapté, cette fois-ci, dans un autre sens, à la nôtre?
Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's an excellent point, that adaptation before the Anthropocene means something different from adaptation now, because it's hard to know what exactly you're adapting to. And I think that nonetheless, in both cases, adaptation is best informed when it is informed by local people and not a one-size-fits-all geographic plan for either the European Union in general or France in general, that at the local and the regional level, there are resources, there's a history, there are stories, there is also a connection with the territory that makes people, gives people that different sort of knowledge for thinking about what adaptation means, even in the Anthropocene, when it's not the regular gusts of the mistral that are very predictable. But I think my intervention on that point is that that we must turn to these more localized and regional systems that have a rich history and that have been intertwined with cultures for such a long time at that scale. But that, even as the exact shape of that weather changes, the strategies and the know-how must be developed, even in more, even through different, for a different climate. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It was fascinating. Yeah. And my question is a bit much of a follow-up to Professor Latour. Yeah. You pointed out, I was fascinated by some of those strategies and local strategies, but strategies to coexist with the Mistral change over time, because technologies, needs of the population change over time. Yeah. So my question is, have you noticed in your studies some when you would have a more the emergency or a number of these particular adaptations and the moment when you see them being abandoned, and can you place it in time?
That's really interesting. You know, you certainly see. I'll answer the second part first. That turning point in weather culture when it goes from being local knowledge, like people that have an embodied, like the body as a barometer, like the body itself as a way of knowing the weather, and then by the early 20th century in France, people are losing a lot of that kind of embodied understanding of regional climate and are turning more to just reading the weather, you know, the newspaper, like reading other people's knowledge about their regional climate. So there is that transition there. And can you remind me the first part of your question again?
When you can see the emergence of so many of these,
yes.
These adaptations.
Yeah. So let me take the example of an emergency in the past, or
like for instance, when you start to have that particular kind of building of the houses. So when you start seeing these things, like that particular construction or the windmills or the share boats, I mean, I can imagine that they are not always the same all over 2,000 years, but you have a
I mean, what I've noticed in the trades, in those earlier trades, is that there's not that, because of technology in part, the evolution of those material cultural objects is slower. As those traditions, there are these slow adjustments that, you know, you wait 100 years and the boats do look different, but it's a slower sense of time there, a slower transition adaptations than you would see, say, like you mentioned, in the industrial era, where you can suddenly produce a bunch of masks or a vaccine in a year, that kind of thing. So that's a really interesting way to think about it. Yeah.
Veux réagir à cette question également?
Oui, je voudrais quand même mettre des nuances à adapter au mot adapter, qui ne signifie pas subir, vivre avec, comme, mais recomposer quelque chose de nouveau, en s'inspirant certainement justement de l'ingéniosité de ceux qui sont venus avant nous, éviter de faire les erreurs de certains. Mais voilà, je pense que le mot adaptation, c'est limite aussi. C'est qu'il faut aller plus loin que l'adaptation. C'est une recomposition de nos activités, de nos manières de vivre, pour ne pas être comme la feuille sur l'eau qui va rester à la surface, mais en se faisant secouer. Je pense que c'est pas dans la nature humaine, puisque c'est pas résister que je veux dire, mais c'est faire plus que s'adapter, c'est vraiment recomposer.
J'aime bien ce terme.
C'est une très belle manière de conclure cette session. On va prendre un break de 10 minutes et puis ensuite on vous retrouve pour la suite des conférences. Merci.